What if I told you that one of the deadliest events in human history is still hiding secrets we can't fully explain? The Black Death is remembered as the plague that wiped out millions in the 14th century. But behind the numbers and the history books, there are stories, strange, terrifying stories that suggest something much darker was at work. This wasn't just a disease. To the people who lived through it, it felt like the end of the world. And even now, centuries later, we're still uncovering chilling details that blur the line between history and horror. The Black Death wasn't just another sickness. It was a wave of death that swept across continents, leaving almost nothing untouched. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe lost nearly half of its people. Imagine that for a second. Every second face around you, gone in just a few years. Entire towns were wiped off the map. Streets that once bustled with life were suddenly silent. Shops closed, churches emptied, and families vanished overnight. In some cities, the dead outnumbered the living so badly that bodies piled up in the streets with no one left to bury them. The speed of the plague was what made it truly horrifying. One day, someone might feel fine, and the next, they would be covered in black boils, struggling to breathe, and gone within days. People began to believe there was no escape, no safe place left on Earth. For survivors, it didn't feel like living through a disease. It felt like living through the end of humanity itself. When the Black Death struck, no one knew what caused it. There were no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria, and no idea that tiny fleas carried the sickness. So people searched for answers in the only ways they could, through fear, faith, and superstition. Many believed it was a punishment from God. Priests preached that the plague was sent to cleanse the world of sin. Entire communities held public prayers and processions, begging for mercy. Some even whipped themselves in the streets, hoping their suffering would make God spare them. Others pointed fingers at strangers and outsiders. Jewish communities, for example, were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. These false accusations led to violent massacres, where thousands of innocent people were killed, not by the plague, but by fear. Astrology also played a role. Some scholars claimed the alignment of the planets had released poisonous fumes into the air. They believed the heavens themselves were punishing humanity. And then there was the idea of miasma, bad air. People thought foul smells and invisible vapors carried death. That's why some carried flowers, herbs, or spices in little pouches, hoping sweet smells would protect them. It's also why plague doctors stuffed the long beaks of their masks with herbs to filter out the so-called deadly air. These beliefs may sound strange today, but for people living in constant terror, they made sense. The plague wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a spiritual, social, and cultural one. It changed how people saw God, their neighbors, and even the world around them. As if the plague itself wasn't terrifying enough, there were strange reports from villages and cities all across Europe, stories that blurred the line between sickness and the supernatural. Some chroniclers wrote about strange lights in the sky, glowing orbs, fiery streaks, and dark clouds that seemed to move against the wind. To people at the time, these weren't natural phenomena. They were omens, warnings that death was about to fall upon them. In other places, witnesses swore they saw shadowy figures walking the streets at night, tall, cloaked shapes carrying scythes or staffs. Wherever these figures appeared, the plague followed soon after. Were they just desperate imaginations fueled by fear, or did people truly believe death itself was wandering among them? Then there were the sounds. Accounts describe the tolling of phantom bells in towns where no church bells rang, and whispers in the night that no one could explain. Some people claimed they heard armies marching through the skies above them, an invisible war being fought between good and evil. And in some regions, there were chilling tales of people touched by unseen hands, only to fall sick the next day. Neighbors whispered about curses, demons, and spirits feeding on the living. It's easy to dismiss these as myths or rumors spread in a time of panic. But what makes them so unsettling is how widespread these reports were. From Italy to England, from France to Germany, people who had never met described eerily similar visions and experiences. For those living through it, the Black Death wasn't just an outbreak of disease. It felt like the very fabric of the world had cracked open, letting something darker slip through. When we picture the Black Death, one image instantly comes to mind: the plague doctor. Tall figures dressed in long dark robes, wide-brimmed hats, gloves, and most chilling of all, the mask with a long bird-like beak. But here's the thing: plague doctors weren't the respected healers we imagine today. In fact, many of them weren't even trained doctors. They were often hired by towns simply to keep track of the dead and sometimes just to offer comfort to the sick. The beaked mask wasn't meant to be frightening. At the time, people believed in miasma, poisonous air that carried disease. So doctors stuffed the beak with herbs, spices, and even vinegar-soaked cloth to filter out the so-called bad air. To them, it was protection. To us, it looks like something out of a nightmare. But the mystery doesn't end there. Some historical accounts describe plague doctors as being eerily silent, barely speaking, and rarely showing their faces. Villagers sometimes feared them as much as the plague itself. Their presence became a bad omen. If you saw a plague doctor walking down your street, it usually meant death wasn't far behind. And because of their appearance, legends began to grow. Some people believed plague doctors weren't human at all, but spirits or harbingers of death. Others thought they carried the plague with them, spreading it rather than curing it. Even today, centuries later, the image of the plague doctor has become one of the most haunting symbols of death and disease. But back then, to people already living in terror, seeing one on the horizon must have felt like watching the grim Reaper himself walk into town. The Black Death killed so many so fast that the living couldn't keep up with the dead. In city after city, churches ran out of burial space, cemeteries overflowed, and soon mass graves, what people called plague pits, became the only option. Some of these graves were carefully dug. Priests tried to bless the ground, and bodies were laid side by side, almost as if people still wanted to hold on to dignity in death. But many others were not so orderly. In places like London, Florence, and Paris, the dead were dumped into pits by the hundreds. Bones piled over bones, with no prayers, no markers, no names. For survivors, this was more than just horrifying. It was unthinkable. In the medieval world, a proper burial meant peace for the soul. To be thrown into a pit without ceremony felt like being abandoned not just by the living, but by God himself. And then came the darker practices. Archaeologists have uncovered plague graves that show disturbing details. In some, bodies were burned, perhaps to stop the disease from spreading, but also out of fear that the dead might rise again. In one village in England, skeletons were found with bricks shoved into their mouths. Why? Historians believe the villagers thought these people had turned into revenants, the restless dead. By stuffing bricks into their mouths, they hoped to silence them, to stop them from spreading plague from beyond the grave. Other bodies were pinned down with heavy stones or had their limbs broken before burial, as if people feared they would crawl out of the earth. These weren't just desperate acts against disease. They were acts against something people believed was far darker: spirits, curses, or even the dead themselves returning. To us, these rituals may look like superstition, but to those who lived through the terror of the Black Death, they weren't just fighting sickness, they were fighting the unknown. The Black Death wasn't just a plague of the body, it was a plague of the mind and spirit. For the people who lived through it, the true terror wasn't only in the sickness itself, but in everything it destroyed around them. Families abandoned each other out of fear. Parents left their sick children. Friends stopped visiting friends. Some towns became so empty that survivors said it felt like walking through a graveyard, even in broad daylight. Religion, which had always been a source of comfort, became another source of fear. If this was God's punishment, then what hope was left? Some turned to desperate faith, joining processions, whipping themselves in the streets to show repentance. Others turned their backs on the church entirely, convinced that prayer was powerless against what they were facing. The social order itself began to collapse. With so many dead, fields went untended, markets closed, and law broke down. In some regions, people gave in to chaos, drinking, looting, and living wildly as if tomorrow would never come. This was the deeper horror. Not just the disease, but the feeling that the world itself was unraveling. That nothing, no family, no faith, no authority could save them. And when people lose everything they trust in, fear fills the empty space. That fear made the Black Death more than a historical tragedy. It turned it into a nightmare that haunted an entire generation and left shadows that still unsettle us today. For all the history we've uncovered about the Black Death, some mysteries remain unsolved. And these unanswered questions are what make the story so haunting. Take the strange lights in the sky, reported in towns across Europe. Were they just comets, meteor showers, or the northern lights? Or were they something people truly believed were omens of death? The records are too scattered and vague for us to know for sure. What about the shadowy figures people claim to see before outbreaks? The cloaked shapes, the silent watchers. Were these simply rumors born from fear, or did some people genuinely believe death walked among them in human form? And then there are the plague doctors themselves. Were they only misunderstood men trying to protect themselves, or did their strange bird-like masks fuel the idea that they were otherworldly? To villagers, their presence almost always meant more death. So it's easy to see why they became symbols of doom rather than healers. Even the graves raise more questions than answers. Why did some communities fear their dead so much that they broke their bones or sealed their mouths with bricks? Was it just superstition? Or were people actually witnessing things that convinced them the dead weren't staying in their graves? Science today explains the plague as a bacterium carried by fleas. But to the people who lived through it, the explanation was far more terrifying: that something invisible, unstoppable, and maybe even supernatural was hunting them. And that's the part we'll never truly know. Were these just desperate imaginations during a time of panic, or did the Black Death unleash horrors that history has only half recorded? The Black Death is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in human history. A sickness that wiped out millions, shattered families, and reshaped entire societies. But when you look closer, it's more than just history. It's a story filled with mysteries, strange sights in the sky, silent figures in the streets, unsettling rituals around the dead, and questions we still can't fully answer. To those who lived through it, the plague wasn't just about disease. It was about fear, superstition, and the sense that something larger, something darker, was moving in the shadows. And maybe that's the real horror of the Black Death. Not only the lives it took, but the way it left people questioning everything: God, science, and even reality itself. Centuries later, the graves are silent, the plague doctors are gone, and the streets of those medieval towns are alive again. But the haunting stories remain, and they remind us that sometimes the most frightening parts of history aren't the things we can explain, but the things we can't. The Black Death is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in human history, a sickness that wiped out millions, shattered families, and reshaped entire societies. But when you look closer, it's more than just history. It's a story filled with mysteries: strange sights in the sky, silent figures in the streets, unsettling rituals around the dead, and questions we still can't fully answer. To those who lived through it, the plague wasn't just about disease. It was about fear, superstition, and the sense that something larger, something darker, was moving in the shadows. And maybe that's the real horror of the Black Death. Not only the lives it took, but the way it left people questioning everything: God, science, and even reality itself. Centuries later, the graves are silent, the plague doctors are gone, and the streets of those medieval towns are alive again. But the haunting stories remain, and they remind us that sometimes the most frightening parts of history aren't the things we can explain, but the things we can't. So now, I'll leave you with a question. Do you think the strange reports of the Black Death, like the ghostly figures and the restless dead, were just fear and superstition, or was there something more to it? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed diving into this mystery, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more dark and forgotten stories from history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.